Olá, gente, boa tarde a todos. Esta aqui é mais uma edição do nossas Interlocuções Internacionais. Na realidade, é a nossa 6ª edição, né? Nós teremos aí ainda mais 3 eventos, talvez 4. Professor José Antônio Caride Gomes, um evento que não está aí anunciado, mas que pode acontecer em parceria com o evento de educação com a professora Maria de Los Angeles Chiqui Gonzalez e também com a professora Isabel Batista, mais para o fim de novembro. Hoje aqui nós temos um convidado super especial, é um convidado que foi nosso professor, convidado no programa em 2019, por meio de Bolsa FAPESP do MAC Pesquisa, Greg Cohen, que é artista, curador, professor de cinema e cultura visual da América Latina na Universidade da Califórnia de Los Angeles, né? Ele tem trabalho em vídeo, fotografia, instalação, multimídia, que já foram exibidos nacional e internacionalmente, né? E que se baseiam em diversos interesses intelectuais e estéticos, desde a teoria da paisagem, urbanismo, arquitetura, até a filosofia estética, memória cultural e arquivos experimentais. Ele é sócio-fundador do Research, que é um grupo de pesquisa de acumulação experimental e arquivos especulativos, e produziu diversos projetos multimídia e multiplataforma, incluindo projetos de pesquisa visual em andamento em grande escala. O Valaco Archive, e o grupo Anarquitetura, Rama Argentina, de 2012 e a 2019, ele também atuou como programador e associado do Los Angeles Film Forum, uma das séries de exibição de cinema experimental mais antigas da América do Norte, né? Desde 2012, ele é co-curador do festival Inappropriation, que é uma vitrine internacional de cinema experimental e mídia de imagem em movimento. Eu e Greg fizemos com uma parceria da nossa disciplina, que Greg ministrou comigo, chamada Cultura da Visualização, um dossiê para a revista Lumina chamada Apropriação, Desapropriação e Inapropriação. Eu deixo aí o link para vocês, para que vocês possam ver e ver aquilo que a gente produziu juntos desde que a gente começou a trabalhar juntos, mais ou menos em 2018, né, Greg? Por aí. Né? Greg, bem-vindo. Ele vai falar sobre pesquisa artística, na verdade é uma pergunta, né, sobre pesquisa artística, e a gente vai passar aqui, como ele vai falar em inglês, a gente vai passar uma tradução, que é uma tradução improvisada, de ajuda, para quem quiser acompanhar o texto com mais clareza. A gente vai disponibilizar também um PDF com essa tradução improvisada, mas, por favor, não é uma tradução muito precisa. Logo depois que ele terminar a fala dele, a gente abre para questões, elas podem ser feitas em português ou em inglês, e o Greg pode responder em português e inglês, que vocês vão ver que ele fala o português muito bem.
Obrigado.
Greg, você.
Bom, muito obrigado, Jana. Um grande, um imenso prazer, um privilégio estar com vocês, com todos vocês. Muito obrigado. Meus agradecimentos para o programa de Educação, Arte e História da Cultura. E então, precisamente, eu vou falar de uma questão. E agora eu vou mudar para o inglês, para apresentar essa questão e explorar as contradições, os muitos problemas internos nessa questão. So, I will switch to English now. Which is maybe part of the question or part of the problem. So I want to begin by declaring my inexpertise, my lack of expertise in the issues that I'm going to discuss with you all. And I actually think that this lack of expertise is part of what enables me to ask the questions themselves. So my locuções are going to take place really, truly inter, that is between spheres of knowledge, but also among all of you, my interlocutors. You are my interlocutors, and so I am going to try and inhabit this space among and between as I present this question. It's also with a mixture of skepticism, lots of skepticism actually, and enthusiasm that I'd like to explore what is actually what we can understand as a recent shift in the academic art world towards what is variously known as artistic research or art-based research. I sometimes think of it as research-based art. That's not a term that we often find, but sometimes it makes a little bit more sense to me. But I will mostly refer to artistic research, a new phenomenon within the academic art world. In a very basic sense, this is a phenomenon, or I don't know, I mean, we could call it, what, a field of study? Do we call it a genre or a movement of art making? Do we call it a methodology, even like maybe a scientific methodology? You see how the question just begets more questions. Anyways, artistic research traces, I think, its origins to the 1960s and to this broad turn towards conceptualism in the visual arts, right? Now, this conceptual turn, in essence, defied artists to question their own practices and their own institutions and demanded that art produce knowledge rather than just objects, okay? Like paintings and sculptures. So the responses by artists to this conceptual call, this conceptual imperative, have often seemed as limitless or as unbounded as they have been kind of unintelligible sometimes. And so one of the familiar criticisms of conceptual art, actually, almost from the very beginning was, or, you know, some people celebrate this depending on your perspective, is that since conceptualism, now everything is art. Everything and anything is art. Or as the art critic and art historian Arthur Danto would have put it, art is whatever the institutions of the art world say it is. So for me, among the many, many versions or manifestations of conceptualism to emerge since the 60s, the one that really interests me here, the one that stands out, I think in particular, is one where artists adopt methods of research from outside the field of art, whether it's from the social sciences or the humanities or the natural and physical sciences, and then they wield these methods as a kind of raw material, as a kind of new raw material for their work. And more often than not, this kind of conceptual research or these research practices assume the form of mimicry. That is, that they imitate in a kind of performative and sometimes even fictive way these non-artistic methods of inquiry in order to generate a critique of the very institutions that sustain those practices. And so really, actually, if you've ever heard of the movement or of a kind of genre of conceptualism called institutional critique, this is really what's going on. You can think of artists like Hans Haacke or Andrea Fraser, the American artist Andrea Fraser, for example. But to me, maybe even of greater interest than the practices themselves, although they're certainly interesting to me, what might be even more interesting for us here today has been the reaction of the institutions of the art world, and especially the ever-expanding number of professional art schools housed at universities and institutions of higher arts education around the globe. And maybe it's been sort of a way for them to heed the demand of institutional self-criticism that conceptualism called for, or maybe it's been a way for them to dodge that command or that challenge altogether, maybe even in a cynical way. But academic programs in the fine arts, for whatever motives, have begun to codify this practice of borrowing research methods from other non-artistic fields, codifying these practices into a new subdiscipline, or interdiscipline we might call it, of studio art, often adding to or supplementing or creating new doctoral programs in the fine arts. So instead of just a Master of Fine Arts, the famous MFA that you can get in studio arts, you can now earn a PhD in studio arts, PhD in fine arts, or in artistic research or art-based research. Now, I want to take a little biographical detour here to tell you why precisely it is, from a very personal standpoint, this question of artistic research and its sort of consolidation in the academy is of interest to me. Now, this in part stems from the kind of stuff that I do, the kind of work that I make, and specifically from often the difficulties that I have in defending or promoting or describing, explaining my work in a more traditional academic context. Because on the one hand, I am, as Janie pointed out, a practicing artist. I make things, although sometimes those things prove very difficult to identify as either scholarly or artistic. And on the other hand, I happen to work professionally in an academic department at a university, and my academic department is a fairly conventional department of literature, the Spanish and Portuguese department. Although I don't teach, I've really never taught literature. And I really don't produce anything that you could see as scholarship. I mean, if you look at my CV, you're not going to see any books, and you're not going to see very many articles published in academic journals. What I do make, what I do produce, and how do I produce it? In what name? Do I produce it? Am I producing it as an artist, as an academic, something else? But whatever it is, my projects seem to sort of exist or reside somewhere in between. They often begin as something that resembles maybe even like art historical research, the kind that you would undertake to sort of eventually write a book or an article. But they very soon begin to express themselves in other ways as I begin to delve into the research. And the research then sort of becomes the art that I'm doing, right? They find their expression my projects through methods and forms that are perhaps closer, but maybe for some people not close enough to conceptual art. And they often assume kind of what I would call fictive dimensions, not fictional, but fictive, a kind of something that sort of invokes fiction, fictive dimensions that even flirt with fakery and with deceit. So needless to say, this kind of project fits very awkwardly at best in either the academic or the studio art context. It's definitely it can seem too playful to be scholarly, and it can seem too academic to be art, right? So it's really like my own struggle, which now is a struggle that I have kind of assumed as sort of my way of being in the world, but it's my own sort of struggle with these questions that has brought me to the bigger question of artistic research. What is it? What the heck is it doing in academies, and why are we offering PhD programs, doctoral programs in studio arts in the name of or under the guise of artistic research? Now, as I suggested, it is the status and evolution of artistic research within academic institutions that concern me or that interest me as much as the methods, the practices of art-based research. Like other efforts or initiatives of interdisciplinarity, much like the program that some of you are studying in, that Gianni teaches in at the Universidade Mackenzie, the field of artistic research has been attempting to define itself really as it goes, as it evolved, ever since it began to take form some, I would say 20 years ago or so in the academic sort of world. But it is really this wholesale professionalization within the academy that has in some ways been so precipitous, so fast, that artistic research has it's had a tough time actually achieving the kind of self-awareness, the kind of institutional self-awareness that it claims to desire or claims to want to generate. So we could say, of course, like if since conceptual art or the conceptual turn, art now must be considered a form of knowledge production instead of a form of just the production of artworks, then obviously, at least from the standpoint of studio arts programs, the way we train artists should change. It has to adapt, right? But the problem is that this production of knowledge, and remember that conceptualism, the whole idea of conceptualism, the whole idea of conceptualism, making art sort of a form of critique of itself and of its own institutions. You know, this paradigm, of art as research, as the now new prevailing paradigm in art, period, is becoming basically as commodified and as marketable as any other kind of art, really, which completely undermines conceptualism's self-proclaimed status as a form of critique. So obviously, this rapid institutionalization of art-based research in the academy seems kind of almost, I fear, almost hopelessly complicit in this commodification of art, whether it wishes to acknowledge it or not. Now, as for the actual practices and products that constitute artistic research as a genre or a field or whatever it is, I think these practices also remain susceptible to this co-optation, this commodification that we're talking to, precisely because artistic research poses a lot of questions about itself that it doesn't quite know how to answer. And here are some of those questions. For example, is the research of art-based research merely the research that precedes the work of art, the art production, the product, or is the research the self the art? For that matter, hasn't art making always been by nature a form of research? I mean, for instance, like research over materials or research into form. And if that's the case, then can art-based research really make any truly radical claims for its difference or its distinction or its uniqueness or autonomy as a kind of interdiscipline of art? On the other hand, if art-based research really is something new, and as doctoral programs in fine arts would have it, if it really is something important, Does that then mean that it has to compete with other forms of research, that it should compete with other forms of research, like say in the natural sciences or the social sciences? Should it complement those other forms of research? Should it subvert them or negate them? Should it try to surpass them as a form of knowledge itself? And what is lost when art, conceived as research, attempts to define itself in terms of science? Broadly construed. That is, to borrow the words of someone who's thought a fair amount about this stuff. Her name is Catherine Bouche. What happens, what's lost when art attempts, quote, to put itself on a scientific basis, unquote. Now, to better understand the stakes of these questions and perhaps the inherent contradictions of the responses to them, it seems worth highlighting a few of the underlying theoretical and conceptual issues and dilemmas of artistic research, if for no other reason than to establish with all of you here that none of these dilemmas can really be resolved all that easily. So what I want to do now is I want to think out loud. I'm going to think out loud with you here now in the spirit of this interlocução. Okay, we're going to interlocute. It's not an English word, but anyways, I'm going to think out loud with you, however imprecisely. I'm just as interested in what kinds of thinking these issues spur in all of you and how we might together perhaps respond to them in some way. So here's my first salvo. Thinking out loud. When we're thinking about what it means to do artistic research, I think what we're asking at heart, or at least in part, is what does it mean to make research rather than to conduct or carry out or direct research? Now, I understand that in Portuguese, this might not translate exactly. Fazer, realizar uma pesquisa. Isn't that what we do? Rather than simply, or we could even say we just, a person pesquisa, faz uma pesquisa. But in English, to make and to carry out are really different things. To make really has the idea of to produce, to construct. So to put it differently, what does it mean? Let's see. I'm asking this, what does it mean to generate a kind of research that is designed to be looked at or listened to or experienced directly with the senses rather than read as kind of the result of a research that preceded it in the conventional sense of the term? And obviously, when we're talking about artistic research, we're not talking about just visual or a visual object per se, but we can talk about lists of sounds, installations, performances, etc. Now, where am I deriving this first question about the making of research rather than the conducting of research? Well, it kind of comes from my own readings of the American philosopher John Dewey, who, writing back in the 1930s in his book Art as Experience, which is kind of his main work on aesthetics, he claims, or he argues, that aesthetic experience coincides with the very process of living itself. That is, with the continual, uninterrupted flow of daily experience. But he distinguishes within aesthetic experience, he distinguishes between two kinds of thought. There are two kinds of thought. One is intellectual thought. It's one that in the academy we're very familiar with. It is a linear, or what he would call a transitive process of thinking that culminates in an aesthetic moment. This aesthetic moment takes the form of an object or a result in which the internal logic of the thought process that preceded it is suddenly perceived. And it's precisely because we're talking about perception that in this moment that we can talk about the aesthetic. That's at least Dewey's framing of the issue. So that would be the first form of thought, or the kind of thought in in aesthetic experience, intellectual thought, which is a thinking that leads to an aesthetic experience. The second form of thought within aesthetic experience is aesthetic thought itself, which for Dewey is a simultaneous process of thinking, perceiving, and making, where the act of thinking is embodied in every moment in the material in which the object or the work, the product, is constructed, right? A simultaneous process of thinking, perceiving, and making. Hence, with aesthetic thought as opposed to intellectual thought, the thinking is the aesthetic experience. They're indistinguishable. And the thinking is simultaneous with the perceiving and the making itself. So again, when we ask what it means to do artistic research, the operative word to me is to make, the verb to make, where the making itself, whether of images or sounds or exhibitions or displays or books of data set, or data sets, where the making itself is the very point, is the aesthetic experience of the art conceived as research. In other words, the making of the research is at one and the same time the medium and the object of art-based research. Okay. Whew. Now, beneath this question of making, of a kind of research conceived to be perceived in the act of its making, lies a whole series of related questions and problems and issues. For example, number one, how does art, images, sounds, performances, etc., how do they know? How do they know? That's a very basic question. In other words, is art as a site, is art a site of knowledge production in the same way that science or philosophy or history or literary criticism can be said to generate knowledge in that transitive way that Dewey talks about? And what kinds of knowledge specifically are generated by things meant to be perceived in the process of their making, rather than read in an academic or scientific journal, for example, after the fact? What is the relationship with reality or with materiality, with the historical world that on which that knowledge is founded when we are talking about the knowledge that is generated supposedly by artistic research? Another question. How, if at all, is the artist simultaneously creating knowledge and creating art? That is, how is it that she is simultaneously creating knowledge at the same time that she is in the act of creating the art? How is it that art making can constitute a form of research in itself? And how are the products of such research to be rendered legible as knowledge? Tough question. Another one. How are the results of such research, of artistic research, how should we measure them? That is, in the way that, scientific research can be measured and verified, tested, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to be an important question, very difficult to answer, I think. When the making of an object meant to be perceived without precisely being read after the fact is in itself the research practice, is then the product of that research also the research? In other words, is part of the very problem here the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that a certain conception of artistic research holds that art is both the making of the research and the product of the research at one and the same time? And finally, I'll throw one last question at you. Can we even consider a practice to be research when by its very design, its nature as a practice, it rejects the idea of an outcome, of a result, or at the very least refuses to determine its trajectory towards some place, some goal? Okay. All right. These are a lot of questions. They're difficult to answer, and I don't have yet to find satisfactory answers to them, but it will probably come as no surprise to anyone that plenty of philosophers and cultural theorists and art theorists and even artists themselves have offered all kinds of answers, often competing answers, to these questions over the years. Now, if we go back to Dewey again, we can right away begin to see the contradictions that arise in these efforts to establish artistic research as a discipline within academic institutions. Because for Dewey, it was the problem for him was that art had gradually retreated away from daily vital experience into the institutions of art, into the museums and into the galleries. And today, we might add, into academic programs in the studio arts, right? This had resulted in the complete separation of art from life that art once enjoyed back in antiquity, for example. To the point that by the early to mid 20th century, it was generally accepted that anything that had to do with daily life couldn't possibly be considered art. Of course, there were iconoclasts in the sense, and Duchamp, with his ready-mades, was certainly militating against this separation. But we could also say that that conceptualism itself was a direct response or a direct rejection of the separation of art and life that had emerged over the centuries, at least in the West. Conceptualism, among many other things, was calling for the reconnection of art and lived experience. But here we are today, witnessing an ever broader effort at the highest levels of the institutional global art world to codify conceptualism as a field known as artistic research and legitimize its isolation within the institution of the academy. To such a degree, in fact, that I think we could say that also today, museums and galleries and biennials and all kinds of art organizations are also gradually adapting themselves to this process of institutionalizing art as research. I want to add right here and right now, as a side note, that I am not against artistic research. I actually practice what might look to many as artistic research, and I happen to enjoy encountering all kinds of things that we would think of as artistic research. But I'm just questioning. I'm really trying to understand, and I'm with all kinds of skepticism, this process of institutionalizing artistic art as research within the academy. So my next question becomes, what are the ideas and the theoretical projects that have given rise to or endorsed in some way this apparent contradiction of art's institutional reassimilation as research? Okay, like on the one hand, we have the kinds of ideas that have very sort of tacitly underwritten efforts to define artistic research itself as a unique form of knowledge production, whether as a wholly autonomous one from other modes of research, or whether a form of knowledge production that is different yet commensurate with these other domains of knowledge, it is of equal value with them. On the other hand, we've got many of the theoretical underpinnings of conceptualism itself, understood in part as a project that has aimed to question the stability of the work of art as a field of knowledge. This has been one, at least, of the thrusts of conceptualism. And it's important to understand conceptualism in this regard as also part of a larger project, a mainly post-structuralist theoretical project of deconstructing knowledge itself, right? Revealing the inherent instability and contingency of all knowledge, at least of what the West had always hailed as like the universal truth and truth value of the so-called human sciences, right? So in the remainder of this interlocution, I want to touch on just a few of these theoretical bases, these thinkers and these ideas, the ones that are often posited by or invoked by today's proponents of artistic research in the academy. And I'm going to discuss them in no particular order, and it's just a couple here and there. And I don't even know if this review is going to lead us anywhere, but I'm willing to just follow the process, and I hope you are too. So, ironically, though perhaps not surprisingly, art theorists and professionals working in higher arts education are the ones who have been maybe most concerned with defining artistic research, whether to distinguish it from other sciences as an autonomous set of methods, or to discard such distinctions and place art on par with any other form of knowledge production. In either case, it seems worth asking whether these efforts aim to legitimize artistic research. I think they do aim to legitimize artistic research as an academic field or discipline so as to make it eligible for institutional support, right? From governments, from university administrations, to make them eligible for grants and fellowships, for the creation of new teaching positions and research positions in higher arts education institutions, universities, right? Okay, well, one person named Irit Rogoff, she's a professor of visual culture at Goldsmiths College in London. She kind of expresses, I think, quite eloquently the contradictory aspirations and challenges or exigencies of artistic research as a so-called field of academic training and professionalization. And I'm gonna cite her here somewhat at length. She says, Irit Rogoff writes, tensions have increased between different tendencies surrounding the field of educating creativity. Old-fashioned notions of inspiration without articulation, slightly less old-fashioned notions of the importance of analytical and critical proficiency. All these vie with contemporary pedagogies of actualization, embodiment, and criticality as the lived-out consequences of knowing. Actualization, embodiment, and criticality as the lived-out consequences of knowing. I hear the spirit of John Dewey hovering in the background of Rogoff's words. For Rogoff, these tensions and these conflicts completely miss the point. The challenge for art in the academy, according to Rogoff, is, quote, not that of specifying what we need to know and how we need to know it, of who determines this and who benefits from it, unquote, but rather to figure out, I quote again, how we might know what we don't yet know how to know, unquote. How we might know what we don't yet know what to know. Open-ended, something more open-ended, ad hoc, improvisational, intuitional. What higher arts education needs to do, in other words, says Rogoff, is to change its vocabulary. So instead of talking about knowledge transfer and assessment, about professionalization, about quantifiable outcomes, about marketability, we should be talking about potentiality, about criticality, about embodiment, about the actualization of knowledge, the actualization of knowledge. Huh? Okay, for me, when I hear this, I say, certainly, art really at its best is about potentiality and criticality and embodiment and the actualization of knowledge. But if that's but this complex aspiration, that's her words, of making this sort of a codified, or making this sort of a pedagogy within institutions, within the academy, seems quite problematic. On one hand, art has to protect its essence as potentiality, as this open-ended form of knowledge production. But on the other, by its very nature, the institutional framework against which this open-ended essence is positioned, that is the academy, by its very nature, the academy demands of its disciplines precisely the kind of professionalization, the quantifiable outcomes, the marketability that are inimical, totally run against the open-ended artistic research that Rogoff is proclaiming, right? Now, these tensions between the need to define artistic research as specific and distinct from a distinct form of knowledge production, and the simultaneous need or effort to legitimize art's existence as a field of measurable professionalization within the academy, I think this tension actually also stems from the very manner in which higher arts education has strived to define artistic research. And here we can turn to, again, to somebody I mentioned earlier, Catherine Bush. In an essay called Artistic Research and the Poetics of Knowledge, she says that before really we revamp the vocabulary of art education and reframe the kinds of questions that artistic research can even formulate, it's probably important first to distinguish between notions, between varying and sometimes competing ideas of what constitutes artistic research as a practice in the first place. And she distinguishes three tendencies. One is to think of artistic research as art that applies research, that is theories or knowledge from other fields. We mentioned that earlier, right? This would be like the oldest relationship between art and science that has occasioned the definition of artistic research. But it's perhaps also the one that's most retrograde. It's so old-fashioned, as Rogoff would say, precisely, and maybe even no longer possible. There's also art about research. This is another tendency. Art that takes scientific or historical or archival research methods as its object, its raw material, by translating systems of classification or experimentation or explication into art in order to comment on those systems, right? Those methods. And to me, this would be where we would put institutional critique. I think that's kind of what people like Hans Haacke and Andrea Fraser are doing. But also we could think of thinking of the Atlas Group, Walid Rad, that long project through the 1980s and 90s about the war and the conflict in Lebanon. Anyway, a third tendency for defining artistic research, according to Bush, is art conceived as research, whereby research is considered part of the artistic process and is carried out by the artist herself, quote unquote. So art here is conceived as a specific site of knowledge production. The research methods themselves are often invented for the art project, and they are also, at one and the same time, the work of art itself, right? And this seems to me maybe getting a little bit closer to what we're talking about, or what Dewey's talking about when he's talking about aesthetic thought, right? But this third notion is perhaps also where the greatest challenge arises, I think, for self-proclaimed interdisciplinary fields or programs that deploy art making as a form of research within an academic context. Why? Well, to my mind, it's because, to varying degrees, and Rogoff observes this, academic research, whether it's in the human or the natural sciences or the social sciences, is goal-oriented. It applies and tests existing theories about what we know, and it distinguishes very clearly between the research and the product. But as we've seen, artistic research, conceived as a method and object simultaneously, and thus as an open-ended process, is really inimical to these disciplinary constraints, to the kinds of constraints that disciplines impose on research practices in accordance with academic notions of scholarship, right? So indeed, Bush herself is at pains to remind us that art, by its very nature, does not set out to determine something or to arrive somewhere, but rather, as she puts it, to, quote, inhabit problems. This inhabiting of problems, in turn, does not orient itself towards a goal or a result. In her words, quote, it must be emphasized that knowledge generated through art cannot as easily be brought to a precise point, as might be implied by the phrase art as science. It is much more about formulating doubt from the perspective of art about certain forms of knowledge production themselves, unquote. Okay, well, that's all well and good. That may be the case, but says Tim Ingold, a British anthropologist who has also weighed in on these matters, we can't forget that the knowledge generated through art is also on some level materials-based. Okay? Its research is about the nature of materials, their unique, shifting, what he calls fluxes and flows. And thus, artistic research is also about the generation of forms, the generation of forms. Indeed, for Ingold, form generation as a form of knowledge production is improvisational. Improvisational. It's forward moving. That is, that it doesn't follow, or that, you know, it's forward moving in the sense that it follows an open-ended trajectory. The trajectory of the generation of forms itself on the basis of the materials. Hence, it is essentially creative. The generation of forms and the trajectory of the research are one and the same. One is continually and simultaneously generating the other. According to Ingold, more conventional forms of research in the humanities, the social sciences, but also maybe a narrower concept of even artistic research, as Bush sort of suggested up there, maybe in definition 1 or 2, those kinds of research for Ingold are actually backwards moving. They begin with an object. Now, in the humanities, we could think maybe they begin with a film or with a novel or a poem or a photograph, or maybe they begin with a city or a building, right? And then they trace form and function back either to a pre-existing theory about its nature or to a description of the intentions of the maker, right? But to make a work of art, says Ingold, is, quote, not to reproduce a preconceived idea, but to join with and follow the forces and flows of material that bring the form of the work into being. As Dewey would say, it is not a transitive form of thought or process, but simultaneously a kind of thinking making, a simultaneous thinking and making and perceiving, actually. I hate to drop names, but you know, if I were a name dropper, I would probably also mention the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who have worked together, and they might use the terms itineration rather than iteration, right? Itineration, from the word itinerary, trajectory. In any case, and this is really interesting, what interests Ingold, in other words, is to restore creativity to research writ large, not just artistic research, but all research, scientific, historical, cultural, etc. That is, what's interesting, what Ingold calls for is the restoration to research of its own improvisational nature, a nature that should be given not to the production of objects, of inert objects, but rather to the generation of forms, which in turn, these forms, can create the possibility for subsequent improvisations. And in that idea, we're going to see that the work of the philosopher Paul Feyerabend actually seems to be at the heart of what Ingold is talking about here. But for me, Ingold's proposition is noteworthy in that it holds that art itself, conceived as research, can somehow actually save the sciences, that is, the traditional disciplines of knowledge, from their own transitivity or linearity, and show them how to regain their own creativity. I think this is fascinating. Of course, a certain tension, or maybe more precisely, a kind of unanswered and perhaps unanswerable question does seem to haunt Ingold's formulation here. And that is this: is art actually a unique form of knowledge production, wholly distinct from the more traditional sciences? Or if more traditional, linear, goal-oriented forms of research can actually be reconceived as creative and open-ended, or perhaps just shown that they've always been actually open-ended, ad hoc, creative, well, then does artistic research lose all of its own specificity And if artistic research has lost all of its specificity, how do we create a field, a defined discipline in the academy around artistic research? Now, upon closer inspection, this very dilemma appears to issue, it seems to come directly from competing theoretical projects that have themselves inspired the whole enterprise of defining artistic research, of artistic research itself. And we could talk about a long list of thinkers, most of them post-structuralist thinkers, but I'm just going to talk about two, for better or worse. I'm going to refer quickly to Michel Foucault, French historian and philosopher, and to Paul Feyerabend, who I just mentioned. Okay, now, to Foucault, art is a different form of knowledge. It cannot be articulated, or he would say it cannot be narrated or presented within institutionally sanctioned fields of knowledge like science and history, etc. Fields that convey their knowledge via the written word. The written word, again, there's plenty of conceptual art that uses text. So I think we need to recognize that what Foucault at least is thinking of here is written word as sort of the writing up of results of research, okay? Of course, the fact that art is so different, is autonomous, cannot be presented, narrated, or articulated within conventional fields of knowledge is precisely what, according to Foucault, makes art so dangerous to power, for sure. Foucault argues that art sets out not so much to, quote, show the invisible, that would be maybe what science does, but rather to show, quote, the extent to which the invisibility of the visible is invisible, unquote. Catherine Bush, channeling Foucault, might suggest that if art is to be understood as a specific form of knowledge, then its force resides in its capacity to, quote, refer to the exclusions inherent in scientific knowledge production, unquote, which is why it can be so problematic to try and translate art into science, right? And impose upon a process of art making those discourses and methods that we think of as specific to or proper to the other sciences, which are often, mind you, seen as superior forms of knowledge production to art itself, if art is a form of knowledge production at all. Actually, Foucault himself, in his essay, The Discourse on Language, which is actually a chapter in his book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault warns expressly of the pressure that institutionally sanctioned forms or fields of knowledge, like the sciences, can exert or will exert on art in order to compel art to base itself on science and thereby limit the extent to which art can render things knowable. Because watch out if art starts rendering things knowable. So this seems to be the implication of what Foucault is saying. Hence, again, the dilemma of art-based research when framed in these terms, in Foucault's terms. To legitimize itself and acquire institutional validation, art attempts to define itself as a kind of science, right? Yet to institutionalize art as a science in this way is to subject it to the disciplinary power of constraint. Those are Foucault's words, power of constraint, and thus undermine art's distinction, its autonomy, its freedom, which is founded on practices wholly divorced from the scientific method of assessment and quantification, right? So again, as we have seen, to define itself as distinct from the sciences and at the same time as a valid science, artistic research has often turned to what it conceives as its own openness, its reliance on intuition, its subjectivity, and its resistance to outcomes or conclusions. You know, this intuition, this kind of anarchic, sort of open-ended, intuitive, ad hoc essence that seems to characterize art's distinction from the other sciences. Now, for the anarchist philosopher Paul Feyerabend, this intuitive, subjective, open system of research is actually not specific to art, and therefore ought not to pose a problem at all for the establishment of artistic research in the academy. At least that would be my reading of Feyerabend. That is how many people have read Feyerabend in this whole project of artistic research, as a matter of fact. So Feyerabend is not writing about art himself, but he's writing about the science and the scientific disciplines. But like I said, lots of people who are trying to understand artistic research and define it and find its place in the academy have turned with great enthusiasm to the ideas of Feyerabend. So against the conundrum for artistic research posed by Foucault, Feyerabend opens a kind of door. He opens a certain door for art as research, artistic research, by rejecting the very notion of a single, universal, prescriptive set of rules that is a method for science. In his work Against Method, Feyerabend argues that the emergence of new scientific theories through research is essentially anarchistic. That is, the most successful new theories always appear to be counter to observable fact at first. And given that existing understandings of observable fact do not comport with this new theory, scientific research must then adopt ad hoc methods that completely violate existing methods and theories. And as such, these new methods are not inductive, as we often associate with scientific method, right? They are not inductive, but rather instinctual. He goes on to say that these ad hoc and instinctual, and hence open-ended methods, actually serve to make new theories compatible with existing facts, until that point at which other new theories can then change our understanding of the accepted facts and make them compatible with the theory. So the upshot here is that if scientific research itself is at its best an open-ended, ad hoc, instinctual process, then artistic research, which also claims the same things about itself, need not be judged or diminished on the basis of its own ad hoc intuitive methods, right? It is clearly, I think, this anarchistic nature of all science posited by Feyerabend that Ingold, who we talked about in just a few moments ago, who Ingold seems to be invoking when he's proposing that the traditional sciences might reclaim their creativity by following the lead of artistic research. Okay. All right. Well, I don't know where I've gotten us. We've got Feyerabend and Foucault and Ingold and Bush and Rogoff and many others that I didn't mention here, sort of vying for domination in the arena of artistic research as it attempts to ensconce itself in the institutions of higher arts education. Well, perhaps one way to conclude might be to circle back around again to this idea that I discussed earlier about the operative importance, the crucial importance of making as the key to any sense of what artistic research is and whether it truly makes sense as a form of research. Now, I had suggested that what appears to distinguish art from science, if we still want to try and distinguish art from science, in their modes of research is first a matter of making. Art makes its research, which is also made to be perceived, experienced with the senses, while science conducts its research. Or inducts its research by devising theories and then testing them and retesting them and quantifying the results and publishing those results, etc. If we think of artistic research in this way as a practice of making, or what Dewey would say of making, thinking, and perceiving at all the same time, conceived in this way, artistic research meanwhile distinguishes itself from science insofar as it does not test its own theories, right?
Então, gente, parece que a conexão do Greg caiu. A gente vai voltar aí assim que ele retornar. O pessoal está conversando com ele. Tem mais alguns minutos aí que ele tem para concluir o que ele está se propondo a fazer aí nas conclusões dele. Eu queria dizer que o Greg é um parceiro de pesquisa nosso super importante. Ele veio no ano passado como professor visitante, gostou muito do Brasil, teve contato com vários alunos. A gente está aqui fazendo um esforço para a gente manter essa parceria com eles na UCLA, que é uma universidade super importante no mundo todo. Ele agora, neste semestre, ele está fazendo um curso novo, que tem a ver com arte e tem a ver com pesquisa em arte, por isso que ele está questionando todas essas coisas que estão aí sendo apresentadas, sendo colocadas, né? Então, vamos imaginar que este momento aqui é um momento um pouco
Desculpa.
Voltou.
Não sei o que aconteceu. Tinha algum problema com a conexão. Eu tinha mais duas palavras para terminar, para acabar.
Não, então, tudo bem. Vamos voltar, retoma onde você parou e a gente volta aí para terminar, tá bem?
Tá bom. Então, eu falava assim, if we're thinking about artistic research as a practice that makes and that is making its research and making of its research the product, the artwork itself, even in this sense, art, even the kind that calls itself research, would seem to be essentially practice. While science has traditionally conceived itself as a linear, transitive sequence of induction, hypothesis, examination, description, assessment, etc. Right? So now, again, I am coming back to this notion of making, right? Maybe it is that what distinguishes art from other forms, or artistic research from other forms of research, is the fact that art makes its research rather than lead or conducts its research. But I just am not sure that this makes the case for art as both, or this may make the case actually, this may make the case for art as both a unique form of research and one that is equal to, coeval with, all other forms of knowledge production, whether it's the natural or physical sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and otherwise. However, to my mind, it may not strengthen, and maybe it will weaken, the case for the establishment of more doctoral programs in artistic research. So for me, the question of artistic research still remains. What does art stand to lose when we turn it into something that it really, to my mind, shouldn't be, which is a discipline, a predetermined set of rules, or an institutionally constrained series of questions and objects. And now I am done. Fim.
Então, muitíssimo obrigada por tudo que você está aí, por tudo que você
Desculpa o problema com a conexão, não sei o que passou, mas...
Está de volta, acontece, faz parte do processo como um todo, né?
Certo.
Eu tive enquanto o pessoal aqui está se preparando para fazer as perguntas para a gente começar aqui, eu tenho algumas coisas que eu gostaria aqui de observar, né?
Sim.
Primeira coisa, como a pandemia pode trazer também coisas boas, apesar de tudo que a gente vive. A gente não teria um encontro, talvez, como esse, tão interessante e tão instigante, feito dessa forma, que a gente acabou aprendendo a fazer, né? Que é essa forma nova de encontro, né? Você em Los Angeles, nós aqui em São Paulo, um monte de gente que está aqui assistindo está longe de São Paulo, né? Não está aqui porque foi embora na pandemia, muita gente não pertence a uma Mackenzie e assiste por associação e etc. Então, este ponto é um ponto muito interessante. A outra coisa que me veio à mente quando você estava falando, mas aí já diretamente ligada ao que você apresenta, é que você deveria fazer uma palestra para a CAPES. Você sabe o que é a CAPES?
Não sei. Assim.
A CAPES é o órgão que regulamenta o ensino superior no Brasil e que, teoricamente, avalia as nossas produções. E nós que estamos nesse programa, nessa área chamada interdisciplinar, né? Sim. A gente sempre é avaliado pelos cientistas sobre uma produção artística, né? E sempre com a métrica da ciência a respeito da nossa produção, que é uma métrica muito complicada. E nas reuniões que a gente, às vezes, participa com a CAPES, com as pessoas, algo muito difícil de ser explicado, né? Porque há, por um lado, uma incompreensão do que é a arte, por outro lado, uma tentativa de enquadrar a arte como você apresenta aí a história do Foucault, apresentando Blanchot, sobre a arte como algo que precisa ter um limite, porque justamente é preciso entender qual é o enquadramento da arte, e a gente não consegue muito bem se fazer entender nessas métricas, né? Então, pensei na CAPES, e outra coisa que eu quero observar antes de fazer uma pergunta, é como a sua fala é coerente com o que você propõe, porque, na verdade, você produz um pensamento que é muito interessante, porque é sempre um pensamento que vai e volta a respeito do próprio movimento do pensar, né? Então, você apresenta o movimento do pensar quase como se você estivesse apresentando uma obra em si mesmo. Então, acho que tem uma coerência muito grande nesse processo da sua fala, que eu já ouvi observado nas aulas que você dava, que a sua metodologia de aulas é de uma clareza, ao mesmo tempo produzindo esse movimento do ir e vir nos processos, né? Então, acho que é uma delícia realmente ver isso, né?
Obrigado.
Agora, pensando aqui, já elaborando aqui uma pergunta para você, e pensando em tudo isso que você está falando, o que você acha? Você fica pensando, a pesquisa em arte, ficaria em que departamento a pesquisa em arte? Será que seria possível a pesquisa em arte num departamento, por exemplo, de História da Ciência? Não seria muito interessante ver um departamento de pesquisa em arte em História da Ciência?
Eu acho legal, acho ótimo. Na verdade, nesse conceito, a pesquisa da arte poderia se colocar em qualquer outro departamento, né? Outra ideia que não entrou na minha palestra é a ideia do indisciplinar. O indisciplinar de Jacques Rancière, essa rejeição absoluta de qualquer conceito de uma disciplina fixa, né? Porque para ele, as disciplinas não são mais do que o agrupamento transitório, provisório, temporal, eventual, de algumas questões, alguns métodos que são se mudando o tempo inteiro, o tempo todo. Então, eu acho ótimo, eu acho que sim, mas para colocar a pesquisa artística num departamento, digamos, de ciências naturais, então, os pesquisadores científicos da ciência natural também teriam que adotar essa ideia da pesquisa como uma coisa intuitiva, aberta, que segue uma trajetória para frente, sem nenhum destino, etc. Então, teria que ter uma convergência entre as práticas dos artista e as práticas dos científicos, que segundo o Feyerabend não deve apresentar nenhum problema.
Então, o Feyerabend foi muito interessante vê-lo aqui no meio dos nossos autores que nós sempre estudamos e conhecemos, né? E você trazê-lo aqui do contramétodo com uma forma muito interessante de realmente produzir o problema a respeito do método cartesiano, que é o parâmetro com o qual o Feyerabend está trabalhando, né?
Sim.
Tem alguns comentários aqui, olha, que são muito interessantes, que são comentários falando que realmente você deveria fazer a palestra para CAPES. Outro comentário também falando que a equipe da plataforma Lattes também costuma minar, né, as produções artísticas, desaparecem, produções artísticas não existem como forma de colocar lá. Né? E a gente tem aqui, olha, que algumas perguntas já colocadas, por exemplo, Orlando Coelho pergunta o seguinte: a tradução do mundo de uma linguagem para outra, sem reafirmar que é uma tradução, é a sobreposição hierárquica de uma linguagem sobre a outra?
Tradução do mundo de uma linguagem para outra, sem reafirmar que é uma tradução. Pode ser. Não saberia direito responder a essa pergunta. Eu acho que, bom, porque eu imagino, não sei se o Orlando é tradutora. Pode ser, porque esse é o tipo de pergunta que se faz na teoria da tradução, eu acho, né? Claro, a tradução é sempre uma negociação, né? Também um posicionamento intuitivo, eu acho que intuitivo, provisório, de coisas parecidas, mas não idênticas, né? Então, acho que se provisoriamente, por um tempo limitado, mas indefinido, se a tradução do mundo de uma linguagem para outra, sem reafirmar que é uma tradução, se é a sobreposição hierárquica de uma linguagem sobre a outra, coisa é que essa sobreposição hierárquica é provisória, totalmente provisória. Está sendo inflexionada em todo momento. Está se mudando para outro lado sempre. O Deleuze fala nisso. E o Rancière também. Que a prática e a teoria estão numa relação provisória e contingente e inestável em cada momento. E a prática e a teoria formam os momentos, os pontos de uma rede enorme e inestável, que está se mudando em cada momento. Então, eu acho que sim, que a tradução implica esse tipo de sobreposição hierárquica, mas nos meus momentos mais otimistas, eu diria que essa sobreposição hierárquica é apenas provisória.
Uhum.
E pode mudar.
Tem outra questão para você em inglês que fala assim: how to deal with the question of subjectivity in artistic research? Mônica Luz pergunta para você.
Muito boa pergunta. Ela quer que eu responda em inglês ou em português? Vou responder em inglês. That's a very interesting question, Monica. How do we deal with the question of subjectivity in artistic research? I think that the way that artistic research has dealt with the question of subjectivity is to assume subjectivity as part of what makes it unique. In other words, it is precisely the subjectivity, the intuitive subjectivity, the improvisational subjectivity, the open-endedness of subjectivity that lends to artistic research, according to these perspectives, its distinction, its status as an autonomous or unique form of knowledge production. So I think from the standpoint of the artist and of artistic research, it's probably not a problem, but clearly for CAPS or for any institution that wants to try and define and quantify the outcomes of research, be it artistic or otherwise, but especially artistic in this case, then subjectivity undermines the validity of the outcomes, right? So I think this is a contradiction that, I think people like Rogoff are claiming that, no, art just needs to stand up for itself. It's subjective, it's intuitive, it's potential, it's potentiality, it's criticality. It's an embodied form of research. It's not trying to get anywhere. And we just need to own it.
And how to own it?
How to own it? Fazer.
Inscrever.
Inscrever. Totalmente.
Inscrever no sentido de inscrição no simbólico.
Isso é. Inscrição nesse sentido psicoanalítico. Sim.
Mas assim, vamos pensar uma coisa.
Sim.
A subjetividade, de certa forma, ela já entra em alguma medida nas ciências humanas, né? As ciências humanas trabalham com elementos de subjetividade, mesmo que elas sejam chamadas ciências humanas, né? Ou as humanidades, vamos pensar assim, né?
Sim.
De qualquer forma, no caso da arte, há ainda algumas especificidades que ultrapassam o problema da subjetividade na questão das ciências humanas, né? E acho que esses pontos que são muito interessantes de serem pensados, porque, de certa forma, também você vai pensar que a sociologia tem um campo de subjetividade, a psicologia tem um campo gigantesco de subjetividade, né? Mas
Sim.
a arte tem algumas questões próprias que trazem o problema da subjetividade no fazer e no aprender a fazer, ou no tornar visível o visível do invisível.
Certo. Mas também, eu não sei, eu acho que eu mantenho certo escepticismo a respeito desses pontos no arte que supostamente sobrepassam a subjetividade das ciências humanas. Porque a gente poderia pensar naquele tipo de arte tecnológica, onde o artista procura desplaçar. Estou falando português.
Ok, nós entendemos.
Mas,
qualquer pessoa que entende português entende espanhol, não tem problema.
Não, esse tipo de arte tecnológica que procura, que tenta desplaçar o sujeito, deslocar o sujeito para a máquina, não? Ou para o computador, não? É o computador que pensa, o algoritmo, por exemplo, não? O arte algorítmico.
Uhum.
Mas o sujeito, a subjetividade está aí.
Tá, sempre.
É
inevitável. O algoritmo é subjetivo.
Exato. Então, sei lá.
Eu tenho um trabalho de curadoria que se chama Algoritmos Criativos. Eles criam a subjetividade. Bom, isso é uma brincadeira. Vamos lá, é uma brincadeira. Tem outras questões aqui que eu acho que são interessantes, observações. O Agnaldo Jeremias diz o seguinte: se o nosso fazer se traduz em trabalho, e se toda forma de trabalho tido como obra como lugar no mundo, todo trabalho é poiesis, como diziam os gregos. Isso é um comentário dele. Logo depois ele comenta o seguinte: dessa forma, trabalho é poesia, trabalho arte por natureza, pois pressupõe transformação. Assim sendo, se entendida como trabalho, como forma de provocar transformações, a pesquisa é arte. E ele continua dizendo: por outro lado, creio que não haverá uma forma de caracterizar a pesquisa artística exclusivamente como construção de conhecimento ou unicamente como arte.
Eu concordo. É um comentário, uma observação muito, muito fina, muito intrigante. Eu, na verdade, estou totalmente de acordo, eu concordo perfeitamente com essa ideia, que eu acho que é precisamente essa imprecisão da arte como pesquisa e a pesquisa como forma de criatividade que faz, que define, que caracteriza o potencial e o poder da arte e da pesquisa também, né?
Uhum. Ele continua dizendo assim, olha, como diz Edgar Morin, a criatividade se dá no movimento dialógico entre sapiens e demens. Nesse sentido, creio que a pesquisa artística estará sempre neste limiar, como um resultado dessa dialogia entre o prosaico e o poético. Ele continua aí.
Eu adoro a palavra limiar. Eu acho que é nesse espaço limiar que o arte é concebido como pesquisa tem que ocupar, tem que existir e tem que defender de alguma maneira, promover. É isso. A arte como pesquisa, a arte mesmo é um entre. Existe entre, num limiar perpétuo, infinito, de alguma maneira.
Quando você estava falando aqui, uma coisa que também me veio à cabeça, não sei se você conhece, a ideia de abduction do Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce. Talvez você não conheça porque ele é americano, então os americanos não conhecem os americanos, mas tudo bem.
Sim, o Charles Peirce. Eu conheço um pouco da obra de Charles Peirce, mas né, esse conceito de abduction...
Abduction é uma forma de pensamento que ele elabora de raciocínio. São 3 raciocínios. Ele diz que existe um raciocínio dedutivo, um raciocínio indutivo, e ele diz que todas as formas de pensamento que são inovadoras, mas isso era para a ciência, elas são advindas do pensamento abdutivo, de abduction. E ele é responsável pela formulação de hipóteses. Né? Então, muitas pessoas que estudaram semiótica na vertente do Peirce, elas continuam pensando na abduction como uma espécie de pensamento das artes.
Certo.
Né? O próprio Umberto Eco traz este elemento do pensamento que foi uma cadeia de pensamento muito diferente de outra, ela se encontra de uma forma inesperada e produz um tipo de pensamento novo, era a forma como ele pensava a abdução. Então, na hora que você estava falando da ciência, a gente estava lembrando
disso. Não fica tão longe das ideias de Feyerabend, eu acho.
Não fica de jeito nenhum.
De jeito. Também não de Dewey. Eu sei que o Peirce é o pragmático mais conhecido do que Dewey, mas...
Agora, né, nos últimos anos, né?
Nos últimos
Dewey
anos.
foi mais conhecido, né, durante o tempo todo de produção.
Certo, porque Deleuze se interessava muito por Peirce, por em cima de Saussure. Mas também é interessante que, por exemplo, na antropologia visual, as ideias de Dewey têm sido valoradas de novo nas últimas décadas, ao menos aqui nos Estados Unidos. O Sensory Ethnography Lab de Harvard e o trabalho de Lucien Castaigne-Taylor, por exemplo, cineasta e
claro.
teórico, ele que colocou no seio do projeto de sensory ethnography, etnografia sensorial, as ideias de Dewey neste respeito.
Muito interessante.
Sim.
Gente, alguma pergunta a mais? Aqui, estou esperando, se alguém tiver mais alguma pergunta. Enquanto isso, eu vou fazer aqui 2 propagandas. A primeira propaganda que eu vou fazer é de um evento que eu vou participar amanhã, no MAC da USP, que é sobre pesquisa em curadoria e arte. Acho que a Helena tem o site aí para vocês, tem o e-mail aí para mandar para vocês. Esse aí é a pesquisa em curadoria e arte que vai acontecer no ensino superior. Então, eu vou lá falar justamente do Mackenzie, do nosso programa, contar ali, né, ele é um webinário que o MAC USP está fazendo, e amanhã, então, por volta das 4 horas, eu vou mandar o link, eu vou mandar o YouTube aí para vocês, aqui no site, tá? Para vocês verem, amanhã por volta de 4 horas, eu, Cauê e Edson, eu esqueci. Bom, são 3 pessoas, vamos falar sobre ensino superior. Na verdade, 6 pessoas, começa às 2 horas e termina às 6:30 da tarde. Estão todos convidados, é também pelo YouTube, super simples. E outra coisa, eu queria convidar vocês de novo para a exposição que eu estou fazendo a curadoria, que é a exposição do Aldo Tambellini, chamada No Princípio Era Tudo Preto, que é um artista americano-italiano que decidiu que também quer ser brasileiro nos últimos tempos, e eu estou fazendo uma curadoria online. É uma exposição que acontece na Galeria Casa Branca, e essa exposição é uma forma estranhíssima de fazer curadoria, porque ela acontece num site, e esse site vai crescendo, e a gente vai, né? Então, eu fiz entrevistas com vários curadores que trabalham com a obra dele, eu recebi depoimentos de curadores, o próprio Aldo ia participar de uma live, não conseguiu, porque ele adoeceu, mas ele deve participar, e essas coisas vão crescendo, ele me manda os documentos aos poucos que ele tem, coisas que ele fez no Brasil, trabalhos que nunca tinham sido publicados, e a gente vai produzindo e organizando isso no site, tornando ali, dando uma forma para ele. É bem bacana essa estrutura. Um dia eu quero escrever sobre isso, como forma de pesquisa em curadoria, que é uma coisa muito, muito interessante, acho muito uma experiência nova, não tinha vivido isso ainda, que é uma consequência desse momento aí da pandemia, né? Bom, gente, vejo aqui que não tem nenhuma pergunta, então, Greg, você quer falar alguma coisa final? Quer trazer alguma coisa para finalizar?
Só repetir meus agradecimentos pelo convite, essa belíssima experiência de estar de volta, de alguma forma, em São Paulo, na Mackenzie, com a Jane, mesmo neste formato tão estranho, que é o virtual. Eu gostei demais, como eu esperava, e realmente foi um imenso prazer, um imenso privilégio estar com vocês.
Obrigadíssimo, Greg. Quero agradecer também a professora Rosana Schwartz, que é coordenadora do programa, que nos ajuda a fazer esses eventos, que dá apoio a esses eventos. Quero agradecer a Helena Prats e o Gabriel Oliveira, que são pessoas que trabalham mão na massa, fazendo a coisa acontecer. São o Gabriel mestrando, a Helena doutoranda, né? São os colegas aí que nos ajudam a produzir tudo isso que está acontecendo. Quero agradecer a participação de todos vocês. Obrigada mais uma vez por estar aqui, compartilhar conosco aí este momento, e especialmente ao Greg pela generosidade e parceria desse tempo todo de trabalho aqui conosco. A gente continua trabalhando juntos, tá, Greg?
Espero que sim. Acredito que sim. Tchau, beijões.
Tchau.
Tchau.